My name is Gideon, and if you told me yesterday that my life would completely fall apart in the span of a few hours, I would have laughed. I thought I had it all. A steady career, a beautiful home, and most importantly, a loving wife, Celeste, who was the center of my world. But as I sit here in a house that no longer feels like home, staring at the locks I changed less than an hour ago, I realize I've been living a lie. Last night started off deceptively normal. Celeste mentioned she had dinner plans with a few old colleagues from her PR firm. She'd been talking about reconnecting with people for weeks, so I didn't think much of it. In fact, I encouraged her. I always wanted her to have her own space, her own friends. I never wanted to be the overbearing husband. I still remember the way she looked when she walked out the door. Confident, radiant, and stunning in a deep emerald dress I hadn't seen her wear in years. It was the kind of dress that turned heads, the kind of dress you wore to feel powerful. "You look incredible," I told her as she adjusted her earrings in the hallway mirror. She smiled at me, but there was something off about her expression. A flicker of hesitation? Guilt? I couldn't quite place it, but I brushed it aside. "Don't wait up," she said, her voice light and breezy. I laughed and told her to have fun. She kissed me on the cheek, and just like that, she was gone. I spent the evening trying to relax, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching anything. My mind kept drifting to her. Maybe it was the way she lingered by the door before leaving, or the fact that she'd spent so much time getting ready. Something about it didn't sit right with me. By the time the clock struck 9 p.m., my unease had settled into my chest like a heavy weight. It was around 9:30 when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She must have forgotten it. Normally, I wouldn't even think about touching her phone, but something compelled me to check. I told myself it was harmless. I'd see who it was, let her know later. But the name on the screen made my stomach drop. Victor. Victor wasn't a colleague. Victor wasn't even someone I'd heard her mention before. The message preview read, "I'm here. Can't wait to see you." My hands trembled as I unlocked her phone. A password I'd never had to use before now, but one I'd memorized over the years without thinking. The conversation was a dagger to the heart. A string of flirty texts, plans for the evening, and messages that left no room for interpretation. Victor wasn't just some old friend. He was her lover. The man she'd been sneaking off to meet while I sat at home, trusting her, loving her. Couldn't breathe. My world felt like it was tilting off its axis. Anger surged through me, followed by waves of betrayal and disbelief. How could she do this to me? To us? To the life we'd built together? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the messages, reading and rereading them until every word was burned into my memory. The timestamp on the last message said 7:45 p.m. She'd been with him for nearly 2 hours now. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed my car keys and drove. I didn't even know where I was going at first, but my gut led me to a small, upscale restaurant on the other side of town, the one she'd mentioned in the texts. My heart pounded as I parked across the street, scanning the windows for any sign of her. And there she was, sitting at a corner table with Victor, laughing, leaning in close. She looked happy, happier than I'd seen her in months. I couldn't watch anymore. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I felt like I was going to explode. But instead of confronting her, instead of making a scene, I drove back home. I needed to think. I needed to do something, anything, to take control of this nightmare. When I got home, the sight of our front door made my decision for me. I called a locksmith. I didn't care that it was late. I needed to do something drastic, something that would remind her that actions have consequences. By the time she came home, this house would no longer be hers. It was nearly midnight when the locksmith finished. As I was testing the new locks, my phone buzzed. It was her. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as her name lit up. She was probably calling to say she'd be late, to lie to me one more time. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to hear her voice. But when the phone buzzed again, I answered. "Hello," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Gideon," she began, her tone soft and sweet. The sound of her voice made my stomach turn. "I'm on my way home." Dinner ran a little late. I couldn't help but laugh. A bitter, humorless sound. Take your time, I replied. There's no rush. When she arrived home, bags in hand and a smile plastered on her face, she was met with a locked door, and me standing on the other side, ready to do what had to be done. The moment I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, my heart started racing. I stood by the door, listening as her heels clicked against the pavement, each step bringing her closer to the truth I'd uncovered. My palms were sweaty, my breath shallow, but I was resolute. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing her that I wasn't the fool she clearly thought I was. She knocked lightly at first. "Gideon? The door's locked," she called out, her voice still carrying that same saccharine sweetness. I didn't answer. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and she knocked again, harder this time. "Gideon, did you lock the door? Let me in. It's late." I opened the door just a crack, enough to see her startled expression. She wasn't expecting me to be standing there. Her smile faltered as she took in the look on my face. Cold, unreadable. "Why is the door locked?" she asked, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. "Good question, Celeste," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe it's because I had some time to think while you were out. You know, during your dinner with friends." The air between us was thick with tension, her confusion quickly giving way to a flicker of panic. She tried to step inside, but I held my ground. "Gideon, what's going on? Why are you acting like this?" she demanded, her voice higher now, almost desperate. But I wasn't about to let her control the narrative. Not this time. "What's going on?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly. "That's rich coming from you, Celeste. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Or should I ask Victor instead?" The color drained from her face. For a moment, she was completely still, her wide eyes betraying the fear she was trying so hard to hide. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but it was too late. The truth was written all over her face. "Oh, come on, Celeste," I snapped, throwing open the door all the way now. "Don't insult me with your lies. I saw the texts. I saw you at the restaurant. I know everything." She gasped, stepping back as if I'd slapped her. You followed me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The audacity of her indignation nearly made me laugh. "Don't twist this around," I shot back. "You're not the victim here. I didn't follow you. I connected the dots, something I should have done months ago. You've been lying to me, sneaking around, treating me like an idiot while you parade around with your boyfriend." Her mouth opened and closed, like she was searching for the right words but couldn't find them. Finally, she managed, "Gideon, I swear, it's not what you think. Victor is just—" "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. Just don't. I'm done listening to your excuses. I trusted you, Celeste. I believed in you, and you threw it all away for what? For him." She tried to step inside again, but I blocked her path. "Gideon, please," she pleaded, her eyes welling up with tears. "We need to talk about this. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, my voice icy. "I understand that the woman I've loved for 9 years has been betraying me behind my back. I understand that while I was here, working hard to give us a good life, you were out playing dress-up for another man. And I understand that you don't deserve to be in this house anymore." Her jaw dropped. "You can't mean that," she said, her voice breaking. "This is our home." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "Your things are packed. They're in the garage. You can take them and go. As far as I'm concerned, we're done." Her tears spilled over now, and she shook her head in disbelief. "You can't just throw me out like this. Gideon, I made a mistake, but we can fix this. Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I shot back. "That you didn't mean to hurt me? That it was just a fling? Save it, Celeste. I've heard enough lies for one night." She reached out, trying to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Gideon, I love you," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up, But please don't do this. We can get through this together. I laughed bitterly. Love? You call this love? No, Celeste. Love is trust, respect, loyalty. And you've shown me that you don't have any of those things. She was sobbing now, clutching at the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Please, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't give up on us. But I'd already made up my mind. It's too late for that, I said, my voice firm. You gave up on us the moment you chose him over me. Now go. Take your things and go. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me with a look of pure devastation. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the garage. I watched as she loaded her bags into the car, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. As she pulled out of the driveway, I closed the door and leaned against it, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. My heart felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces, but for the first time in months, I also felt free. It wasn't the kind of freedom I wanted, but it was a start. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. My life would never be the same again. As the sound of her car faded into the night, an unsettling silence filled the house. It was deafening, yet oddly comforting. A stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. I slumped onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall, my mind replaying every word, every tear, every lie that had unraveled the life I thought we had. The house, which once felt alive with memories, now felt hollow, like a shell of what it used to be. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to call someone, anyone, to let it all out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would I even call? My closest friends were her friends too. Our lives had become so intertwined that there was no easy way to separate the threads. And then there was the humiliation. How could I tell anyone that the woman I devoted my life to had betrayed me so cruelly? The thought of it made my chest tighten. I put the phone down and buried my face in my hands, the weight of everything pressing down on me. For the first time that night, I let myself feel it. The hurt, the anger, the betrayal. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I didn't want to cry over her. She didn't deserve my tears. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to get up and move. Sitting there, wallowing in my misery, wasn't going to change anything. I wandered through the house aimlessly, every corner reminding me of her. The photo of us on our wedding day still hung in the hallway, her radiant smile frozen in time. I ripped it off the wall and shoved it into a drawer, slamming it shut with more force than necessary. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, and leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the darkness. My mind was a storm of questions. How long had this been going on? Was Victor her first, or had there been others? Was our entire marriage a lie? Or was it just the last few months that had unraveled? I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty, and the answers seemed forever out of reach. Just as I was about to take another sip, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was her. Of course, it was her. I ignored the call, but the buzzing continued, relentless. Eventually, I picked it up and stared at the screen. 10 missed calls. 12 text messages. I didn't read them. I couldn't bring myself to. I blocked her number instead. For the first time that night, I felt a small sense of control. She'd taken so much from me. My trust, my peace of mind, my marriage. But she wasn't going to take my sanity. Blocking her was a small act of defiance, but it felt like a victory. The hours dragged on and sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of the past few weeks. The late nights, the sudden need for privacy, the way she seemed to light up whenever she checked her phone. All the signs were there, but I'd ignored them, convinced that my wife could never do something like this. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a loud banging on the front door. My heart raced as I stumbled out of bed, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. Was it her? Was it Victor? I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and crept toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I looked through the peephole, I was met with the sight of Celeste, her face tear-streaked, her hair a mess. She was still wearing the emerald dress, now wrinkled and disheveled. She looked desperate, broken, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Gideon, please," she begged, her voice muffled through the door. "Just let me in. We need to talk." I didn't respond. I stood there, watching her through the peephole, my grip tightening on the bat. She banged on the door again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. Don't do this to me, Gideon. Please." Her words sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. "Don't do this to you?" Was she serious? I couldn't believe the audacity. She had destroyed everything we had, and now she was acting like the victim. Finally, I spoke, my voice cold and firm. "Go home, Celeste." "This is my home," she cried, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, okay? I messed up. But you can't just lock me out like this. We can fix this, Gideon. Please, just let me in." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. "Fix this? How do you propose we fix this, Celeste? You think we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend like it never happened?" "I love you," she shouted, her fists pounding against the door. "I love you, Gideon. I made a mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." Her words were like poison, seeping into my mind and twisting the knife she'd already planted in my back. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this," I said, my voice low but steady. "Go, before I call the cops." She froze at that, her sobs quieting as my words sank in. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she let out a broken whisper. "Gideon, don't do this." I didn't respond. I just stood there, listening as her sobs faded into the night. Eventually, I heard her footsteps retreating, the sound of her car door slamming, and the engine starting. I stayed by the door until the sound of her car disappeared, leaving nothing but silence behind. As I turned to go back inside, I caught sight of myself in the mirror by the door. I barely recognized the man staring back at me, tired, angry, and heartbroken. But there was something else in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Determination. This wasn't the end of my story. Not by a long shot. The silence after Celeste left was heavier than anything I'd felt before. It clung to me, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the locked door, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions. Her words echoed in my head. "I love you, Gideon." It was almost laughable. Love? What kind of love drives someone to betray their partner so completely? The house felt haunted now, every room a reminder of her. The couch where we'd sat together for countless movie nights, her laugh filling the air. The kitchen where she danced around while cooking, teasing me for being a terrible chef. Even our bedroom, a space that once felt sacred, was now tainted with the weight of her lies. It was unbearable. I needed air. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold night biting at my skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes in the early hours of the morning. I walked aimlessly, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, my breath visible in the crisp air. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I were dragging the weight of my broken marriage with me. My mind replayed the events of the past few hours over and over, like a cruel loop I couldn't escape. Her tears, her pleas, the look on her face when I refused to let her in. It was all burned into my memory. Part of me felt satisfaction, knowing she was finally feeling some of the pain she'd caused me. But another part of me, a softer, quieter part, felt hollow. Despite everything, I had loved her. I still did in some twisted way, and that made it all so much worse. Eventually, I found myself at a small park near our house. The playground was empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. I sat down on a bench, my hands trembling as I tried to process everything. The memories came flooding back, uninvited and relentless. I remembered the day I proposed to her, how her face lit up with pure joy as she said yes. I remembered the way she clung to me during our first dance at the wedding, whispering that she couldn't wait to spend the rest of her life with me. I remembered the late-night talks, the laughter, the quiet moments of just being together. It all felt so real, so perfect. And now it felt like a cruel joke, a lie I'd been too blind to see. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos of us. There we were, smiling on a beach during our honeymoon. There she was, holding the puppy we'd adopted together. And then there was a photo of us at a friend's wedding, her head resting on my shoulder as I kissed her hair. Looking at those pictures now, all I could think about was how much of it had been a facade. My finger hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. As much as I wanted to erase her from my life, I wasn't ready to let go of those memories. They were a part of me even if they were tainted now. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I made my way back home. The house felt even colder in the morning light, the emptiness more pronounced. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall, waiting for something. I wasn't even sure what. The day dragged on in a haze. I ignored the buzzing of my phone, knowing it was probably Celeste calling from another number. I didn't have the energy to deal with her, to hear her excuses or her empty promises. Instead, I focused on what little I could control. I called a lawyer. Explaining my situation to the attorney felt surreal. Saying the words out loud, asterisk, my wife is having an affair, and I want to file for divorce. Asterisk made it all feel more real, more final. The lawyer was calm and professional, walking me through the steps I'd need to take. It was a relief, in a way, to have a plan, even if it felt like ripping my heart out in the process. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This was happening. There was no going back. Celeste had made her choice, and now I was making mine. That evening, as the sun set and the house was bathed in shadows, I gathered up every trace of her. Her clothes, her shoes, her perfume bottles lining the bathroom counter, they all went into boxes. The photos of us, the little mementos of our life together, went into another box, which I shoved into the back of the closet. Out of sight, out of mind. Or at least, that's what I told myself. As I sealed the last box, a knock at the door startled me. My heart sank. I didn't need to look to know it was her. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home. But then I thought of everything I'd been through, everything she'd put me through, and I realized I couldn't hide. Not anymore. I opened the door to find her standing there, looking disheveled and desperate. Gideon, she began, her voice trembling. Please, just hear me out. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside, letting her in for what I knew would be our final conversation. Celeste stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes scanning the house as if she was trying to gauge the damage, or maybe trying to read me. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty and desperation. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything was crushing her. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. You've got 5 minutes, I said coldly. She flinched, clearly not expecting my tone. Gideon, I know you're hurt. I know I've messed up. She began, her voice cracking. Messed up? I interrupted, my voice sharp. That's how you're framing this? A mess up? Celeste, this wasn't forgetting to take out the trash. This was a betrayal. You didn't mess up. You tore our life apart. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I refused to let them sway me. I'd spent too long being blind to her manipulations. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly, her voice trembling. It just happened. Victor was. Stop, I snapped, cutting her off. I didn't want to hear his name. Don't you dare try to justify this. You made a choice, Celeste. You chose to lie. You chose to cheat. And now you have to live with the consequences. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. It was a pitiful sight, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. Not after everything. I still love you, she choked out, looking up at me with red, tear-streaked eyes. Gideon, please. I know I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can start over. Please, just give me a chance. Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a split second, I felt a pang of something, nostalgia, maybe? For the woman I thought I knew, for the life I thought we had. But it was fleeting. The betrayal was too fresh, too deep. "You don't love me?" I said quietly, shaking my head. "You love the idea of me. You love the stability, the security. But real love? That's loyalty, honesty, respect. And you haven't shown me any of that." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't let up. "I've already called a lawyer," I said, my voice firm. "This is done, Celeste. You need to accept that." "No!" she cried, grabbing my arm. "Please, Gideon, don't do this. I'll do anything to make it right. Just tell me what to do." I pulled my arm free, stepping back. "There's nothing you can do," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She stared at me, her face crumbling, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she just collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, unmoving, waiting for her to collect herself. After a few minutes, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "You really hate me, don't you?" she whispered. I hesitated, the anger in my chest warring with the sadness. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you, Celeste. I just can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw real defeat in her eyes. She stood slowly, brushing herself off, and nodded. I'll go," she said quietly, her voice hollow. "But I want you to know that I'll always love you, Gideon. No matter what." I didn't respond. I just opened the door and waited as she walked out, her head bowed. When the door clicked shut behind her, I felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. It was over, really truly over. But as I sat back down on the couch, staring at the empty space where she'd just been, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the fallout. There was still so much to untangle, so much pain to process. And deep down, I knew she wasn't going to let go as easily as she claimed. The house was deathly quiet after she left. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I craved. It was the kind that weighed on me, heavy and suffocating. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to convince myself that I'd done the right thing. That letting her go was the only way to preserve what little of myself I had left. But even with her gone, my mind wouldn't let me rest. Her voice echoed in my head, her words clawing at my resolve. "I still love you. We can fix this." It was maddening. Did she truly believe that after everything she'd done, we could just piece ourselves back together like a broken vase? Trust, once shattered, doesn't glue back together. It stays fractured, weak, a shadow of what it once was. I needed to focus. I needed to remind myself of why I had taken this step. Her betrayal wasn't just a one-time slip-up, it was a deliberate, ongoing choice. She hadn't just hurt me. She'd gutted the foundation of our marriage. And yet, a small, cruel part of me wanted to know more. How long had this affair been going on? How deep did her lies run? I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter where it had sat, forgotten during the chaos of the night before. It felt like a betrayal of my own values to look through it, but at this point, I felt entitled to the truth. I unlocked it, my stomach twisting in knots as I scrolled through her messages with Victor. The texts painted a picture far worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't some fleeting affair or a moment of weakness. They had been seeing each other for months. Long, intimate exchanges that ranged from flirtation to outright mockery of me. I read one message where she told him, "Gideon's so predictable. He has no idea. I almost feel bad." Almost. That one hit like a punch to the gut. She didn't just betray me. She belittled me, reduced me to a joke between her and her lover. My hands shook as I kept reading, the knot in my chest growing tighter with every new revelation. Dinner dates, weekend getaways, lies she'd told me to cover her tracks. It was all there in excruciating detail. I tossed the phone onto the counter, unable to stomach anymore. The anger that had simmered under the surface erupted, and I slammed my fist against the table. How could she do this to me? To us? What had I ever done to deserve this level of deceit and cruelty? I paced the kitchen, trying to calm myself, but it was impossible. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. Her favorite mug on the counter, the coat she'd left hanging by the door, the photos of us on the fridge, smiling and happy, now mocking me with their lies. I ripped the photos down in a fury, tossing them into the trash. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, I wasn't going to cling to its remains. The house felt more like a prison with her presence lingering in every corner, and I knew I needed to start reclaiming it as mine. I grabbed a box and began throwing her things into it, her shoes, her books, the little trinkets she'd collected over the years. By the time I was done, the box was overflowing, but the house still felt tainted. My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. I hesitated, thinking it might be her again, but when I checked, it was a text from my lawyer. He had already started preparing the paperwork and needed a few more details from me. It was a stark reminder that this wasn't just about emotions anymore. It was about dismantling a life we'd built together. There would be legal battles, financial arguments, and the inevitable drama that came with separating after nearly a decade of marriage. Part of me wanted to crumble under the weight of it all. But then I thought about those texts, her laughter at my expense, the way she had used my trust against me, and I realized that as painful as this was, it was necessary. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly wondering, doubting, second-guessing. I deserved better than that. By the time evening rolled around, I had finished packing the rest of her things and left the box by the front door. If she wanted her stuff, she could come and get it on my terms. I locked the door, poured myself another glass of whiskey, and sat down at the table, letting the silence wash over me. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. My stomach churned when I saw her name. Against my better judgment, I hit play. Her voice came through the speaker, soft and trembling. "Gideon, I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please, don't let this be the end of us. I'll do whatever it takes. Just call me back. Please." I stared at the phone for a long moment, the anger and sadness swirling inside me like a storm. But I didn't call her back. Instead, I turned off the phone and sat there in the quiet, letting the weight of everything settle over me. This wasn't the life I wanted, but it was the one I was left with. And somehow I would have to find a way to move forward. Alone. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt like an intrusion. It illuminated the mess in the house, the packed box by the door, the ripped-down photos, the empty space where her presence used to linger. It reminded me that this was my reality now, a reality I had to face whether I liked it or not. I spent the day avoiding the box by the door. Seeing it made my stomach churn, a sharp reminder of everything that had unraveled. I busied myself with small tasks, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. Laundry, cleaning the kitchen, sorting through old paperwork. Anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But no matter what I did, thoughts of Celeste crept in, uninvited and unwelcome. By the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the box, staring at it like it held all the answers. Her favorite sweater was on top, neatly folded, the smell of her perfume still clinging to it. It was so ordinary, yet it hit me like a punch to the gut. I grabbed the box and shoved it into the garage. Out of sight, out of mind. At least that's what I told myself. Just as I was settling back into the quiet, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Another message from her. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the notification. I didn't want to listen, but curiosity got the better of me. I hit play. "Gideon," her voice began, shaky but insistent. "I know I said I'd give you space, but I need to see you. Please, just one last time. I need to explain everything. I'll come by tonight. I need you to understand." My jaw clenched as I deleted the message. I didn't want her explanations. I didn't want her excuses. She'd already told me everything I needed to know with her actions. But part of me couldn't shake the unease. She wasn't going to let this go, and I wasn't sure how far she'd go to force a conversation. That evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, I locked the doors and closed the blinds. I wasn't in the mood for another confrontation. But as the hours passed and the silence grew heavier, a nagging feeling took root in my gut. Something told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot. At around 10 p.m., I heard it. A faint knocking on the door. My heart sank. She was here. Gideon? Her voice called softly from the other side. Please, I just want to talk. Just for a minute. I stayed silent, my body tense as I stood in the kitchen, out of sight. She knocked again, harder this time. I know you're in there, she said, her voice wavering. Please, Gideon, just let me in. Her tone wasn't pleading anymore. It was sharp, almost angry. She was losing patience, and it scared me. I grabbed the bat from the closet, just in case, and crept toward the door. You can't avoid me forever, she shouted, her voice rising. I'm not leaving until you talk to me. I stayed rooted to the spot, my pulse pounding in my ears. She kept knocking, kept yelling, until finally, I heard her footsteps retreating. The sound of her car starting up was a relief, but I knew this was just the beginning. Celeste wasn't the type to walk away quietly. When the house was quiet again, I sat down at the table, gripping the bat tightly. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from anger. This was the woman I had once trusted with my whole heart. Now she was a stranger who refused to let me move on. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, waiting for the next knock. Morning came, but I didn't feel rested. I hadn't slept at all. My body was drained, my mind wired, running over everything that had happened in the past few days. The betrayal, the confrontation, the knocking at my door. Celeste's voice still rang in my ears, her desperate words clinging to my thoughts. I needed to end this, for good. By noon, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for her next move. I picked up my phone and, for the first time since blocking her number, I sent her a message. Me, your things are in the garage. Pick them up and leave. I don't want to see you. After today, I want no more contact. No pleasantries. No emotions. Just a clear message. I sent it and waited. She read it almost instantly. A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared. Then they disappeared. Then they reappeared. She was typing, then stopping, then typing again, like she didn't know what to say. Finally, a response came through. Celeste. Okay, I'll come by later. I just want to say something before I go. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening on the phone. Of course she does. But I didn't respond. I didn't care what she had to say. Her words didn't mean anything anymore. By evening, I sat by the window, watching the street, waiting. I didn't want another scene. I didn't want more drama. I just wanted her to take her things and leave. At 7 p.m., her car pulled up. She stepped out hesitantly, wearing an oversized sweater and jeans. The same kind of casual outfit she used to wear on lazy Sundays at home. It was an intentional move, I was sure of it. She wanted to look familiar, approachable, like the woman I used to love. I stayed inside, watching as she slowly walked to the garage. She stood there for a moment before lifting the door and seeing the boxes stacked neatly inside. I could tell she was hesitating, maybe hoping I'd come out. But I didn't. She started loading the boxes into her car. Every now and then, she glanced toward the house, maybe expecting me to break, to come out and say something. But I didn't move. After the last box was in, she lingered. She stood there in the driveway, staring at the front door, unmoving. Then, she did something that made my stomach twist. She walked up to the porch. I tensed as she raised her hand and placed it gently against the door, fingers splayed. It was a strange, intimate gesture, as if she were memorizing the feel of it, saying goodbye in her own way. Then, she whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I could read her lips. I'm sorry. With that, she turned and left. No more shouting. No more banging on the door. No more pleas. Just silence. As her car disappeared down the street, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It was over. Finally, truly over. I didn't feel relief. Not yet. That would come later. But for now, I felt something close to acceptance. This chapter of my life had ended, and no matter how painful, I had survived it. I turned off the porch light and locked the door. Then, for the first time in days, I went to bed, knowing I wouldn't be waiting for another knock.